Hi everyone. Complete demolition of the Bulgarian Embassy in Moscow. Putin gave them 24 hours to get out. Details right now. Just imagine how, in literally one day, the capital became the arena for a real diplomatic drama. Russian President Vladimir Putin issued an ultimatum that no one expected. 24 hours for the brotherly people to get out of the Bulgarian Embassy in Moscow. This decision shocked both experts and ordinary citizens. In essence, a story that seemed impossible just yesterday is unfolding before our eyes, and the consequences could change not only Russian-Bulgarian relations, but also the balance of power in Europe. Today we will analyze point by point how it came to this, why it is important, and what it means for all of us. Let's start with what led to this shocking decision. The history of diplomatic relations between Russia and Bulgaria has always been difficult. Back in the early 2000s, relations seemed stable. But with the growth of European integration of Bulgaria, tension began to build. For many years, Moscow watched the growing influence of NATO in the region and the growing criticism of Bulgarian politicians towards Russia. Recent months have exacerbated the situation. First, there was a scandal surrounding diplomatic real estate. The Bulgarian side began to demand the right to expand the embassy territory, which Moscow considered a violation of diplomatic norms. It would seem a formality, but it became the trigger. Why is this important? Because diplomacy in the 21st century is built not only on treaties, but also on symbols. An embassy is not just a building, it is a projection of the state, its face. Any violation of the rules of interaction sends a signal not only to the neighbor, but to all partners. That is why Putin's ultimatum became so resonant. For the first time in many years, Russia has directly stated that a violation of norms will be met with an immediate and tangible reaction. This changes the balance not only in relations with Bulgaria, but also in the eyes of all countries in Eastern Europe and NATO. The next important aspect is the reaction of Sofia and preparation for possible consequences. Bulgarian diplomats were shocked. In the first hours after the Kremlin statement, messages appeared on social networks about chaos in the embassy, emergency meetings, and attempts to find legal loopholes to avoid demolition. But, as you know, deadlines are crucial in diplomacy. 24 hours is not just an ultimatum. It is a demonstration of force that forces you to act quickly. Many experts note that such a gesture could serve as a signal to other countries. Russia is ready to act decisively, and even Bulgaria's allies will not be able to intervene before the consequences become obvious. What does this change? First of all, it shows that diplomatic rules are no longer a guarantee of the safety of buildings and property of foreign states in Russia if these states behave, in Moscow's opinion, unfriendly. In practice, this means that any country must take into account the risks not only in the economy and politics, but also in the purely physical safety of its diplomats. Minor violations or provocations can now escalate into an immediate reaction with the highest degree of publicity. When the ultimatum was announced, Moscow turned into a scene of diplomatic action that could not be ignored. Special services were sent to the location of the Bulgarian embassy in the capital. Everything happened as organized as possible. First, the territory was cordoned off to prevent access to unauthorized persons. Then, employees and visitors were evacuated. It would seem like a bureaucratic process, but its scale and publicity made the events a real show for observers. People passing by noted an unusual combination of discipline and scale, as if the city was preparing for a major military operation, but without a single drop of violence. The demolition of the building took place in stages. First, the fence and old decorative elements were removed. Then they began dismantling internal structures and communications. And in the end, the facade of the building became the symbolic center of the action. Architectural elements that had stored decades of diplomatic history disappeared at the hands of workers, and cameras captured every moment. On the streets of the capital, onlookers gathered. Many filmed what was happening on their phones and shared their impressions on social networks. Some described what was happening as the largest public demonstration event in recent years, which is both shocking and fascinating. Why is this important? Because Moscow showed not only strength, but also control over the process. The operation was transparent, but at the same time instantaneous. The signal was sent not only to Bulgaria, but also to Moscow's all neighboring countries, as well as allies in Europe. Russia is capable of acting quickly and publicly if it considers the actions of a foreign state to be unfriendly. And this changes the rules of the game. The usual diplomatic norms no longer guarantee the safety of buildings or property if Moscow decides that the situation requires intervention. Bulgaria's reaction was swift, but chaotic. Emergency meetings of parliament in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs began in Sofia. Diplomats tried to find legal ways to stop the demolition, sent notes of protest, contacted allies, but time was against them. 24 hours is not only a symbol, but also an instrument of pressure. With each passing minute, the opportunities for maneuver were reduced, and Bulgaria was forced to adapt. International media reacted with a loud resonance. European publications called the ultimatum unprecedented and discussed the possibility of a new stage of cold diplomacy. Analysts pointed out that such actions could set a precedent that would force other countries to revise their approaches to diplomacy in Russia. NATO and the EU watched the developments with anxiety and bewilderment, and diplomatic circles began to discuss how such ultimatums could affect the security of international missions. What does this change? The first international consequences are obvious. Bulgaria is losing some influence in the region, and Russia is demonstrating its willingness to act independently of the opinion of the outside world. This affects the strategic calculations of all countries in Eastern Europe and forces Bulgaria's allies to think about possible risks in any provocations or unfriendly actions towards Moscow. And of course, this changes the usual perception of diplomacy. Now publicity and speed of action become part of the strategy, and not a secondary element. During the demolition, the Russian side seized some materials for verification for compliance with security laws. Bulgaria tried to remove some historical documents, but only partially succeeded. This shows that behind the facade of diplomatic protocol lies a real struggle for information and influence, where every element matters and can affect subsequent events. To fully understand the scale of what is happening, you need to look back at the past. Cases of demolition of diplomatic missions have occurred in world practice, but have almost always occurred quietly, without public resonance. In the early 2000s, individual consulates faced conflicts over real estate or security, but decisions were made in private, with caution and a minimum of noise. Today we are seeing a completely new strategy, an ultimatum, public demolition, and control over archives. This is an open demonstration of strength that is difficult to ignore. Why is this important? Historical parallels help to understand that the world is changing. If diplomatic buildings were previously considered inviolable, now a public demonstration of resolve shows that the rules can be adjusted depending on the situation. This creates a new standard for all countries. Any violations, according to Moscow, may be met with an immediate and tangible reaction. This is a signal to the international community. The usual foundations of diplomacy no longer guarantee stability and security. No less important is the reaction of Russian society. Literally, everything was discussed on social networks, on the streets of the capital, and in comments on the news. From the discipline and scale of the operation to the potential consequences for foreign policy. Many noted the impressive speed and organization of actions, while others expressed concerns about the stability of international relations. But almost everyone agreed that the process was organized without threatening people's lives, which adds confidence and trust in the authorities. The publicity of the action became a strategic element. People see that the state is capable of acting decisively and flawlessly. What does this change? Public opinion plays a key role in modern conflicts. Public support strengthens the position of the state, creates internal legitimacy, and forms an image of strength on the international stage. This element cannot be underestimated. Even the most large-scale diplomatic actions are perceived differently when the domestic population approves of the measures, and the information effect reinforces the country's position. The next aspect is the internal diplomatic dynamic. The events surrounding the Bulgarian Embassy became a lesson for all Russian and foreign diplomats. It is now clear that any provocations or violations of the rules of interaction can cause an immediate and public reaction. Diplomats within the country are discussing new standards of behavior, anticipating potential risks, and revising their work strategies. For foreign representatives, this is a signal. Diplomatic flexibility and caution are becoming key, and any delay or underestimation of the situation can have serious consequences. No less important is the cultural and symbolic aspect. An embassy is not just a building. It is the face of the state, its symbol. Public demolition destroys not only the physical structure, but also the usual perception of diplomatic security. For Russian citizens and observers abroad, this is a clear signal. Rules exist, but their observance depends on the strength and willingness to protect one's interests. After the public demolition of the Bulgarian embassy, events began to shape long-term consequences for diplomacy and the country's strategic position in the region. Bulgaria was forced to urgently revise the work of its representative offices in Russia. Temporary offices, rented premises, and revision of work plans have become a forced measure. Diplomats noted that the previous system of functioning had been disrupted, and now they have to look for new ways to maintain a presence in the capital, minimizing risks. Why is this important? The loss of a fully fledged embassy means not only physical discomfort, but also a decrease in influence in the region. Bulgaria, as a member of the European Union, is losing some of its opportunities for prompt interaction with Russian structures. In addition, the situation demonstrates that Russia is capable of acting independently of external assessments and diplomatic pressure. This creates a new precedent that will become a guideline for future actions in similar cases. The international diplomatic reaction was diverse. European and American analysts spoke of an unprecedented step and speculated about the possible beginning of a new phase of cold diplomacy. NATO discussed the risks for all members of the alliance who may find themselves in a situation where the usual diplomatic rules cease to apply. And this changes the landscape of international relations. Bulgaria's allies realize that intervention in the crisis may be limited by the time frame and speed of Moscow's actions. What does this change? First of all, it stimulates a rethinking of international protocols. Countries are beginning to consider scenarios in which traditional security guarantees for diplomatic missions may be violated. This changes the approach to planning the work of embassies and consulates, to risk assessment, and to preparing for potential crises. Moreover, it forces the state to revise strategic goals and take into account that speed and publicity of actions can be decisive. The next point is expert forecasts. Political scientists and military analysts note that the demolition of the embassy and the ultimatum show Russia's willingness to act quickly and demonstratively, using diplomatic, informational, and symbolic tools simultaneously. Some experts call this a new standard of strategic impact, when physical action is combined with informational and political components, forming a complex effect at all levels. No less important is the psychological effect for Bulgaria. The event was a shock that revises the perception of one's own capabilities. Inside the country, they began to discuss how to ensure the safety of the diplomatic corps and assets in the future. The international community, observing the course of events, receives a signal. Publicity of actions can be an effective tool of pressure, and an ultimatum is a way to instantly change the rules of the game. It is at this moment that a key question arises. How will other countries in the region act? The precedent with Bulgaria may become a benchmark for those who assess their diplomatic risks and opportunities for influence. For Russia, this is a chance to show strength and determination, and for Europe and NATO, it is a signal of the need to adapt strategies. Meanwhile, new details are appearing in the media. The Russian side continues to control the archives and documents that were in the embassy. Bulgaria tried to urgently remove some historical materials, but only partially succeeded. This adds drama. Behind the facade of diplomatic protocol lies a real struggle for information, and control over it becomes one of the key elements of the strategy. And here we come to the very essence. The demolition of the Bulgarian Embassy in Moscow and the 24-hour ultimatum show that diplomacy has ceased to be merely an exchange of official notes and polite visits. Russia has demonstrated the ability to act quickly, publicly, and strategically, combining physical actions, control over information, and symbolic effect. This step was a signal to the whole world. The usual rules of diplomacy cease to be absolute if the interests of the country and its security are violated. For Bulgaria, this means not only the loss of some diplomatic influence, but also the need to revise the entire strategy of working with Russia. For Europe and NATO, this is a lesson. Now each country must take into account that ultimatums can change the usual balance of power in a matter of hours. And this changes not only tactics, but also strategic thinking. The world is no longer static, and the usual scenarios of predictability can be broken in an instant. Inside Russia, the effect is also significant. Society sees the resolve of the authorities, trust in government actions is strengthened, and international partners begin to respect the speed and accuracy of decisions. This confirms that strength is manifested not only through numbers or weapons, but also through the ability to instantly respond to external challenges, combining publicity and strategy. And what does this mean for the coming weeks and months? We can expect a new stage of diplomatic caution, a revision of security rules, and increased control over diplomatic missions. The ultimatum and demolition of the embassy create a precedent that will be taken into account by all countries building relations with Russia and with each other. The world is changing before our eyes, and it is such events that are forming a new map of international politics, where decisiveness and speed of action are valued on a par with long negotiations. And in this lies the key to understanding. The usual schemes of diplomacy, previous guarantees and rules of behavior are no longer an absolute protection. Publicity, information control, and strategic action are becoming part of the new reality. Russia has shown that it is capable of acting decisively without losing face and without violating the principles of international ethics. In conclusion, watching the events in Moscow, we see that the history of diplomacy is being rewritten before our eyes. The demolition of the embassy is not just an episode, it is a symbol of a new era, when diplomacy and politics are closely intertwined with information, symbolism, and publicity of actions. And what happens next depends on how countries adapt their strategies and learn lessons from this precedent. Write in the comments what you think about such an ultimatum. Do you think Bulgaria will be able to restore its influence? And what consequences will this event bring to Europe and the world? This moment is a point of revision of all ideas about diplomacy and strategic planning. And it is you who are watching its development today. M.